I'm sitting here on a beautiful Saturday morning and it's sunny outside, it's springtime, and I was thinking about what happens when the life that you've built, the identity that you've worked for is suddenly gone. Not slowly, not subtly, but in a way that forces you to ask, who am I now? And maybe even harder, do I let anyone see this version of me? Today's conversation isn't just about addiction or recovery. It's about what happens in this space after everything falls apart. And the moment that someone decides to stop hiding. If you've stepped away from drinking or the things that used to numb you, you know it changes your life. But it changes the people watching you too. You become quiet proof that something better is possible. On Sober Life Rocks, we talk with people who realize that their choice wasn't just personal, it was a platform, a chance to be a leader, to shorten somebody else's learning curve, to do something that really mattered. If you felt that pull, you're in the right place. Subscribe and stay with us. Hi, I'm Margie Schaller, and today I'm here with Dr. Gary Hartman. Gary spent nearly 2 decades as a periodontist working in a high-performance clinical environment with complex surgeries, constant pressure, and the kind of work where there isn't a lot of room for error. From the outside, it was a successful and respected career. But behind that, there was a very different story unfolding, one that ultimately led to addiction, incarceration, and the loss of everything he had built. Today, Gary's in recovery and is speaking openly about what happened, not just to tell a story, but to open up conversations that don't happen nearly enough, especially in high achieving professions. Gary, I really appreciate you being here today with us.
Hi, Margie. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share my story and be a part of your podcast. I really think it's cool what you're doing and respectable and much needed discussions, and I'm happy to be a part of it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I kind of want to go. If I had met you at the height of your career, before anything unraveled, what would I have seen? And also, what would I have missed?
That's a very good question. At the height of my career, I think things were I was in full-blown addiction at that point, and I was presenting a version of myself to the public that was completely opposite of who I was inside. And that sort of contradiction was one that ate at me personally, and like a cancer, just kind of destroyed my identity from the inside out. So I had this feeling of never really being truly honest with myself and everybody else. If you were to see me, I think I would have presented myself as this successful practitioner running this, really busy, successful periodontal practice. But on the inside, you'd see somebody that's scared to death that I was going to be exposed, that my addiction was going to be uncovered, that when the next shoe was going to drop, or when was this all going to come to an end. And so I had this internal fear always running through my veins about what's going to happen and how is this going to end. I felt like I couldn't stop. I tried but couldn't. And I was in this runaway train that I succumbed to the fact that I was either going to die from this addiction or I was going to get stopped. And this was kind of what happened and how my story unraveled.
How did you get there? I mean, a periodontist is a surgeon in the mouth, and
Right.
that's a really highly trained, highly educated, highly respected profession. It seems like it's something that would be glorious if that's the sort of personality that you have. Like, how did you go from there to where you were as you just described?
I think it's a combination of things. As you said, the practice of periodontics is very stressful. It involves a lot of complex, complicated procedures. And like all phases of dentistry, all specialties and aspects of dentistry, we are under constant pressure to perform, We very rarely get a break in between patients. Just the constant volume of these high stress procedures, high focus, little time off in between tends to
Did you
erode
like
its.
it?
I did. I liked the satisfaction of being able to provide a service for patients and help people. I didn't like necessarily when things didn't go well. So I guess you could consider myself a perfectionist, and that was kind of my undoing in a way. I always wanted things to go well, and when they didn't, I internalized that a lot. Like, it was this my fault? What could I have done differently? And I replay this picture over and over in my head that slowly just ate away at me to the point where I had never really developed any coping strategies for this type of stress early on in my life. And all I knew was alcohol and addiction and using substances to run from my emotions and to escape this stress and this story that I would replay over my head over and over again. And so that kind of was how it started. I loved it. I was always interested in healthcare from the very beginning. And I get into this career that's high stakes, high decision making, very complicated, complex procedures. You add in the anxiety of the patients and them not wanting to be there and they're scared to death. So you're kind of like a psychologist on top of that. In addition into running a practice and all the stress that's involved with, day to day running a business. Over time, it just gets to you. And I believe that I, like most people, suffered from burnout and depression and then ultimately addiction. So that's kind of how my story progressed.
So I was listening to what you said, and I heard you say that drinking had always been um, present. So that to me signals high school drinking, college drinking, further education drinking, and my guess is that all started out fun and social.
Yes, absolutely. It was early on. My first exposure to alcohol was a kid, was age 13. And I guess you can say when I was a young man, a young kid, adolescent, I always suffered from this anxiety, this fear that I wasn't quite enough. My father was a cardiologist, had a very loving home, very stable upbringing, but I put a lot of pressure on myself to achieve and to make it to the next step. And I developed this perfectionism that kind of came in over time and really translated into a high degree of stress and anxiety. And when I took that first drink as a 13-year-old, we always talk about it in our recovery groups. What was that like? And I can remember that feeling of, wow, this is the answer to my problem. All my stress melted away, my worries went away. I was more socially engaged. I was funny. I felt like this was it, my magical elixir. I found the answer to my problem. And I fell in love with that and I wanted more. And it was a weekend thing all through high school and into college and became more of a crutch as I progressed through dental school and into my profession. It became more, I'm using this as a medicine to cope with things, to deal with stress. And it worked, as we always say, until it didn't, and then
Mhm.
things started falling apart.
I have a vivid memory of my own. I was a single mom at the time dealing with a highly litigious ex-husband, running my own business. And previous to that, I had always kind of justified my drinking as sort of the art form of combining food and wine. And to the point where I would cook, steak and mushroom sauce for my toddlers so that I could justify having this glass of Cabernet.
That's right.
But I remember vividly there was a moment when I was at the grocery store and they used to have, I don't know if they still do or not, but those 6-pack wine carriers that if you bought 6 bottles, you would get 10% off the whole purchase. And I thought to myself, this is now just something I need to live this unbearably high pressured life. And it was no longer, there was no more denial that this was just about the art form. This was now clear to me, and I accepted in that moment, standing there in the grocery store, like, yep, this is now just what I need to move forward. Oh well. Was there a moment for you when you recognized that this was your self-medicating moment?
Absolutely. I can't really put my finger on a moment, although I had several moments of clarity, like, reaching for the bottle and saying, this isn't right, or I can remember, when the kids were young and it was a Saturday, when I crossed into that zone of drinking alcoholically, I would tell my wife that, I'm going to go get donuts for the kids. And I would stop at Farm Fresh and get a 6 pack of these little wine bottles and start drinking them at Saturday morning before I go home. And I can remember vividly one moment when I just happened to, in my car, look in my rearview mirror and just say to yourself, said to myself, this isn't right. This is absolute insanity. But I knew I'd already crossed that line and I was going down that path. And I kept drinking. I kept drinking and realizing that, I'm an alcoholic, but I was okay with it. And it wasn't until things really started falling apart at home that I started really, getting more and more blackouts and having issues with relationships and health that I decided to finally get help and stop drinking at one point.
Okay. And so how
Yeah.
did that go?
So I decided that I had had enough. So my wife and I were having trouble in our marriage. We looked into different things. Okay, I can go to an AA meeting or I can get a big book and start reading, but I didn't really know how to get started. And so we researched and found this program called Intensive Outpatient Program, the IOP. A lot of us from recovery know about that. It's sort of like a residential rehab light where you're able to continue working during the day. I went to 3 hour sessions 4 times a week for 6 weeks. And that was really good initially. It helped me understand AA. It helped me understand what sponsorship was, how the steps work, how to share at meetings, those things. But like many newcomers, I didn't take it altogether seriously, and I took parts of the program and said, I'll use this part, but not this part. I'm going to cater this to how I like to live. I'm not that bad, so I'm just going to use bits and pieces of it. So, as we all know, in the recovery rooms, the half measures avail nothing, and I was a perfect example of that. I had actually stopped drinking and I abstained from alcohol for a period of time, but I was miserable. There was 2 years there where I was just white knuckling it. I wasn't working the steps. I wasn't dealing with any of the emotional problems or core reasons why I was an alcoholic from the beginning. I just stopped drinking and I was a quote unquote dry drunk for a very long time. two
Gary,
years.
was there a concern uh, that people in the community, patients, potential patients might find out
Yes, a
that
very
you were in this? Yeah. And how did you navigate that?
Yes, that was one of the hardest things to navigate. I remember thinking initially, one of the reasons why I didn't go to a meeting locally in Virginia Beach, I was scared to death that I was going to run into a patient or a doctor or somebody, not knowing or realizing that if they're in one of those meetings, they're in recovery too, right? I just was, paranoid of who's going to find this out. And very much so, Arky, I was one of those people that I'm going to get help, but I don't want anybody to know. And I initially was able to do that. I secretly went to Chesapeake meetings instead of Virginia Beach meetings, and I worked with this IOP counselor for a period of time and was able to work through the program without anybody really knowing. And so, yeah, so my story from there progresses pretty rapidly into, so what happens next? I was in this fragile state of, okay, I'm not drinking, I'm not working the program, I'm pretty miserable. I have all my problems, but no crutch now. And eventually I get a shoulder injury and I had to have surgery for it. And so this was the first time preoperatively I was exposed to an opiate. I was giving a prescription for an opiate medication. And I remember immediately loving the way it made me feel. It basically took away all of my concerns, all of my anxieties, all my fears. It basically replaced the void that alcohol had left. And I was off to the races, became a full-blown addict with opiates, eventually started writing prescriptions fraudulently, getting in trouble with the DEA and the federal government, and then we can go down that process. But I ended up being incarcerated and getting back and now on my feet in full recovery. It took that low of a bottom for me to figure out, okay, recovery is where I need to be. What I'm doing isn't working. So
When you first were writing those prescriptions for yourself, what was going on inside of your head?
I can tell you sheer desperation. I was at the point where it didn't take long for me to become addicted. Back in 2011, the surgeons used to prescribe these opiates like they were nothing. It was, I got 150 Vicodin first, and then I've got two prescriptions for 60 Percocet. And by the time the surgeon cut me off, I was in a full-blown addiction. I had withdrawal symptoms that would come on quickly after 3 days. I tried to stop, and I remember thinking, this is just too impossible. The physical pain and mental anguish from not having these pills was just too hard for me. And so I crossed that line out of sheer desperation. I was either going to go to the streets and turn to heroin or buy pills in some sordid place, or hey, I've got this great idea. I write prescriptions every day for patients for these procedures I do. I'll just shift in one of these to one of my friends and have them give me pills back. And that started this 4 year process of writing these prescriptions for people that slowly progressed on this runaway train to several people and several years of prescription writing. And, the tolerance that developed where I started with 2 to 3 pills at first led to 10 to 15 pills when I got stopped. And the federal government added all those prescriptions all together and said, over 4 years, this is the equivalence in drug weight that you have been distributing to people. And because I was writing prescriptions to people and they were giving the prescription back to me, that was considered distribution. So now I wasn't just faced with a simple fraudulent prescription writing, I was faced with a felony count of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances like a heroin dealer would be faced with. And the federal government told me, you're in deep trouble. We're going to be going after you. You're looking at 8 to 14 years, which was, incredible to think about how far this has gotten and what the results and the consequences were of all this.
I have
So,
to ask, before we move through into the next chapter of the story,
sure.
Gary, how did you reconcile treating patients while you were also impaired?
Very good question. My addiction gotten to the point where I could not function without taking any medicine. In other words, I couldn't get out of bed. I was at the point where I was nauseated, sick, you name it, muscle cramps, bone pain, and incapacitated by every ounce of the word. And I took the pills to quote feel normal, which doesn't sound right, but it was the hell I was living in. I was not getting high. I wasn't feeling out of control or incapacitated. I was taking the pills just to function. And that, craziness went on for 4 solid years. But I look back and I say, was I under the influence of opiates when I was treating patients? And the answer is yes. And that's one of the most embarrassing and hardest things for me to admit and to come to grips with. And it's tough.
So, when this moment came and the federal courts came after you and they sentenced you, what did you believe about yourself in that moment?
Well, I felt like a complete failure. I felt like this was, I should have known better. How did this happen? Look at what I've done. The amount of guilt and shame that I've had to overcome over the years, even, to this day, I still struggle with it to some degree, what I put my family through, what my wife and children had to be exposed to. This was not only just a career loss and a loss of freedom, but this was also a very public downfall. I was on the Virginia Pilot News. I was on the channels 3, 10, and 13, morning, noon, and night for a week. Opiate ring, a doctor exposed for running an opiate ring. Dirty doctor does this. The titles were so
Mm,
humiliating. I absolutely felt like I have let down so many people, and I felt terrible about myself. I really
mm.
did. It was,
Of course you did.
I failed. I have come
Of
to this
course you
point
did.
where I'm in. You asked me, 10 years before that, what would you feel like if you were ever put in prison? I would have laughed at you like, no way. I'm a periodontist and I'm running this practice, and now I'm in a jumpsuit cleaning floors at the chow hall instead of being a periodontist performing procedures on patients. It was the irony and the degree of that downfall that was really hard to deal with mentally.
How long were you in prison?
3 years and 9 months I spent away from my
Mm,
family. And this was during COVID as well. So it
mm,
was, especially troubling time because COVID restrictions meant that we weren't able to work. We couldn't go outside and get recreation. We weren't able to see any visitors. So I went for a year and a half not seeing my wife and children, and very little talk on the phone. There was phone restrictions too. So when I left, my children were 10 and 12, and I came back and they were 14 and 16. And you wouldn't believe the amount of difference that takes place in a 10-year-old, especially for your boy to be turned into a man in front of your eyes behind a plexiglass prison wall, was brutal, and was really a low in my life that, us together as a family had to push through. And it's amazing we came out the other side. It really is. They are doing well. They're both well adjusted. My two kids are, one's in college, one's getting ready to go into college. You would think they would fall apart or have some mental crisis or turn to drugs and alcohol. They managed to stay together, hold it together, become strong, resilient young adults. And I'm so proud of them.
mm,
And my wife, she went through the ringer and supported me the whole way. And it hasn't been easy on our marriage for sure. We've been through a lot of therapy, a lot of counseling, and we continue to do it. But thankfully she's in Al-Anon. So I want to put a little plug out there for Al-Anon, because if it wasn't for that, she wouldn't have any understanding. This is a disease that can happen to anybody, and it's a family disease. It affects all of us. So she had a lot of help with her Al-Anon peers, her sponsor, and she works the steps, and she's very involved in that. And I think that's the primary reason why we were able to stay together.
mm.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm so happy to hear all that.
Me too. Thank you.
Okay, so Gary, we talked a little bit about this before the show.
Mhm.
There are certain professions, doctors especially, but also we know, some lawyers, some government officials, some pilots who are just held to a higher standard. And quite frankly, for good reason, right?
Mhm.
I don't want my doctor or my pilot or my attorney to be as human and fallible as I am. I
That's
want
right.
them to be better. I want them to be perfect, especially when they're interacting with me. And so the result is that oftentimes people in those professions adopt a little bit of that godlike presence, that persona. You almost have to
That's
in
right.
order to be good at what you do. And so when the fall comes, not only is it deeply humiliating, which you so um, vulnerably shared, but also it leaves you with, now who am I? Now what
Right.
am I?
That's right.
And so I kind of want you to share with us that piece of the story and how then you came to where you are deciding that how to navigate reemerging into life and what you're going to say to people.
Right. Very, very good question. I think that's one of the most challenging things of this whole experience has been this identity loss. What is it? It wasn't just a job for me. It was my identity. I introduced myself that way. I was referred to as Dr. Hartman. I felt valued and, more of a sense of purpose. And that was, what I worked my whole life for. I was, top of my class. I tried to get into and got into the best residency program I could. And I felt like I became one of the better periodontists in the area. I was making high stakes decisions, performing complicated procedures. And, I was the expert in the room to now, what am I? I'm starting over. I have all this uncertainty. I feel less relevant than I was before. And that has brought on a lot of grief, a lot of sadness, a lot of anger, and the shame, am I still going to always be defined by my past? It was this constant fear that I had. And from a family perspective, the financial constraints. I was the breadwinner. Now I'm no longer the breadwinner. I'm having to contribute in ways that I can best find I'm able to contribute, but it's not like it was before. So that guilt just builds up over time. And I had to go through a lot of therapy, a lot of step work with my sponsor, a lot of introspection into how was I going to reframe myself, what I find an identity as a person. What am I now? I'm not, it can't be just career based. It's more, what am I going to do? And I have tried to use my experience, my lived experience for something more purposeful, like what I can do, build it in a powerful way, share my story, try to help another person, and then expand my perspective on who I am, as a person, and not just what my career is. I'm a mentor, I'm an educator, I'm a husband, I'm a father, a son, a brother, a friend. I'm a child of God. Yeah, I'm someone in recovery. I'm someone rebuilding. Those things took a lot of time to get into my psyche because I can drive down the street and see my best buddy, my colleague with his street sign up, so and so oral surgery doing great, seeing his practice, and I can easily go right back to look at all that I've lost. Look at who I was. Look where I could be. And it's this constant battle of going back and forth and trying to reframe that, build my recovery as, it's not a disqualification. It's more of a strength. And how can I use that? And so it's been challenging. It's definitely challenging. And at times it's easier than some days are easier than others. But for the most part, I try not to get too far ahead of myself and stay in today.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Um, we get practice, those of us who are in recovery communities, of whatever that flavor is, whether it's AA or a recovery community run by a coach, or we get practice sharing our story, sharing where we're at, what our current feelings are about all that. But when did you decide to first start speaking publicly about this outside of the safety of a recovery community?
I decided to branch out. I guess the what I noticed is that when I am able to be vulnerable, when I'm able to talk about my most deepest regrets, my most embarrassing moments, I'm able to heal and grow just a little bit each and every time. And so from a personal standpoint, it was this helps my recovery. It helps me personally. And then it was maybe I can also help someone else. Maybe someone can hear my story and get something from it and change what they're doing now so they don't have to suffer the same consequences that I had to. So part of my recovery was service working, giving back and trying to help another, especially the newcomer. And so to answer your question, I decided to get out of the recovery rooms and push past my comfort zone. And the first step I did was get in touch with the local Virginia Beach Dental Study Club here, which was the hardest one to do, I thought, because here I am in front of all my old peers that know my story, that used to work with me, and they're all listening with their jaws dropped of everything that I went through and all that I did. And I found that the result of that was not so much shame or finger pointing, like I knew you were in trouble or a bad person. It was this overwhelming amount of support and understanding and compassion and, a line of people waiting to talk to me afterwards. So it empowered me to continue. And I thought, well, if that helped these people and if that was the reception I got from them, then I'm going to keep doing it. So it was that initial step, moving outside the recovery rooms and going into a dental community and saying, here's my story. These people aren't in recovery. Let me reframe my story in a different perspective and see how it goes. And so that's how it started.
And so that there is no more anxious place to be than in front of your
Yeah,
known peers. I mean,
that's right.
that I can't believe that that was your first, but
No.
like amazing.
Yeah.
But how has it been for you going in front of people who don't know you, who don't know your story, who don't know all of this?
It's, I'd say it hasn't been easy. It's definitely, one of those things where I have to build a lot of courage and come to a point where, okay, this is me. It's me accepting my past and moving past that shame and regret and embarrassment and trying to be vulnerable, as I mentioned. And that hasn't been as bad as I thought. You still am met with a lot of people that are just more or less, congratulations that you pulled through this, or that's so impressive that you're in recovery now and have this many years sobriety. We're pulling for you. Whereas initially I thought it was more of people would just be shocked and then not want to have anything to do with me, or more of a you're a disgrace and disappointment and things of that nature. It's been the opposite. So that's, been the challenge for me is pushing past that uncomfortable step and branching out.
One of the things that we had Dr. Brett Kessler on our podcast. He's the
Yeah.
immediate past president of the whole American Dental Association, and he was also very vulnerable and told his story. And he said to us and to anybody who asks that his is a cautionary tale, but it's also one of just wanting to break the stigma, to show that somebody like him, who was at the beginning an ordinary dentist, can fall into these dark places. And he felt so alone, and he didn't have anybody to talk to about it. And as a result, things got worse.
That's right.
And so I wonder whether, as you've started this process of becoming a speaker and of sharing your story so publicly, do you find that this is helping to open up that dialogue to help people who might be in those early stages of struggling with, you know, alcohol particularly, but even other substances, feel like they're not so alone?
I sure hope so. That is definitely one of my goals. I feel like that was one of the reasons why I didn't get help in the first place, was this stigma, and I'm trying to make that a point that it's you don't have to worry so much about asking for help. If it becomes something that you hide and keep secret for so long and your disease progresses to the point where you have some catastrophe or things fall apart, that's the worst time to ask for help. So the stigma is real, I think that's the problem, is that most people, you're judged by your peers, your patients, you're worried about what they're going to think if this becomes public, and then the fear of losing your license. And we talked about it a little bit. It's one of the worst roadblocks to becoming or to asking for help, is that what's going to happen to my license. So as healthcare providers, we're in this unique position of needing to get help, but being so scared and hesitant to get it for ramifications of what's going to happen to your career, that we stay stuck in that disease process and it advances much further along than maybe most people in the general public. Um, but that is the great paradox, it's the very system that is treating and helping these addicted patients is the same system that more or less discourages or doesn't support its own members to get help. And that's
Well, just to
what,
be clear, every state dental board has a diversion program.
right,
And if people are willing to go to that diversion program before too much damage is done, like for you, the damage was done, right?
right,
People who
exactly.
have been sued by a patient when their provider is under the influence, some damage is done. But every state does have a diversion program that will help you retain your license if you go through the program successfully. So I don't want to
Good
just
point.
paint the picture that all hope is lost. There's
No,
actually amazing resources out there, and Brett Kessler really worked hard to ensure that those things were even broadened, so that certain things like insurance companies wouldn't cover somebody who had been through a diversion program in the past. And he's worked really hard to make sure that some of those languages are being changed. But you're right, the fear is real, and the shame is real, and it's people like you who are willing to stand up and say it doesn't have to be this way.
right, right.
It doesn't
That's right.
have to be this way.
And I think you brought up a very good point. There are resources that are available that are open now that maybe in years past they weren't. Specifically, the monitoring programs and the state-run board-related programs. Ours is called the Health Professionals Monitoring Program here in Virginia. But the Virginia Dental Association also has a group of caring dentist committee, they call it, a group of dentists that have been through addiction themselves, that are all peer run, that providers can go to and ask for help and talk about their problems without any repercussions on their license or anything of that nature. In
It's
addition to
amazing.
the IDAA, the International Doctors of Alcoholics Anonymous, that's a doctors only licensed group of professionals that get together and talk about their problems. So there's a lot of resources and a lot of ways to get help. And the point is to try to do that as early as possible before things progress to the point where you have real consequences like mine. Very good
Mhm.
point.
Gary, is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have?
Well, no, I think, we talked about a lot. It's funny when I talk about my story, especially to groups, depending on who it is, almost always everybody wants to know, oh my gosh, how was prison like as a doctor? Those are things that I get. And that's more of maybe just fluff than anything else, but it's real. It was a very dark, trying time. And how I got through that, if it wasn't for the recovery and 12-step program and really a lot of introspection and relying on my higher power, particularly to get through it, I don't know if I could have made it. And that's one of the things that, yeah, I like to stress is that, you can be in the most desolate, isolated, most removed from all of your family and friends place in the world and still feel comfort. You can have guidance and help and a presence of a higher power if you reach out for it. And that is one of the things that I really was remarkable for me in my recovery and my journey through this incarceration process and being away from my family and friends. But no, I mean, I think we covered a lot. I oftentimes talk about all the perils which we discussed with, our profession, particularly burnout and depression, and how we're set up for that, in general. Those are things that probably could take a whole nother hour talking about. But no, yeah, I appreciate it.
And if people are interested in your story and interested in having you come as a speaker or on another podcast, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Well, they can easily look at me on LinkedIn. I have a LinkedIn page. Also, feel free to contact me on my email. I'm always open to that. I can provide that or tell you right now what that is. That's Gary Hartman. That's my name. Excuse me, I'm going to give you another one. Hartman, GAR1 at gmail.com. Hartman, GAR1 at gmail.com. Feel
Perfect.
free to reach out to me anytime. I'd be happy to share any aspect of my story or any resources that I have or know about that can help somebody. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about it. Um,
Mm, thank
That'd
you. We'll put that all in our show notes as well for people.
be great.
You know, um, I'm really struck by the fact that we focus here on this podcast with what happens after. It's not just what somebody went through, but what
Mhm.
happens after. And I was just thinking as I was listening to you talk about a previous podcast we had just a couple months ago by Garrett McClendon, who was a man who started out his life going through the prison system, who started out his life with nothing, who started out his life with no education, no support, no family, and has come out the other side so passionate about this new life that he's been born into, this new life, these new opportunities. He talked about how he can't believe he has his own bank account now. He can't believe how he has a home and a son and a job. And it's just this bright-eyed, bushy-tailed thing. And contrasting that with your story, Gary, where
Mhm.
you had all the things and lost them all.
That's right.
But what I sort of feeling in my body is that yours is a different kind of courage. Yours is a courage of reimagining who you are differently from what you groomed and grew into your whole life. And how do you then take all of this that happened to you and turn it into something that could be life changing, that could be life saving, that could be societally important for people to be able to understand that it's not just the rags to riches, but sometimes it's the riches to rags.
Very
And
good point.
that is where I'm so grateful by your vulnerability, by your willingness. And so I invite anybody listening to say, it's not about do I have this story, but rather what can I do with my voice that might be changing my own narrative about who I am and might be offered out to others to help other people redefine who they are. If this
Yeah.
conversation stays with you, please make sure to share it with somebody else who might be carrying something quietly, because this episode might help them feel seen. Thank you, Gary, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you, Margie. Appreciate it.